After the debut of Young Sheldon, it was presented as an origin story, giving us a chance to see Sheldon's childhood and the entire Cooper family dynamic that shaped the character we came to know and love in The Big Bang Theory. But by tying itself so closely to that future, it sometimes lost its own voice, and its script was often limited by what had already been established and what we as the audience already expected. As a prequel, the show often had to reference or explain moments from The Big Bang Theory, making sure everything fit into a future that had already been established. That connection gave fans plenty of callbacks, but it also limited how far the writers could push the story. To be fair, Young Sheldon is a prequel, and that's exactly what a prequel is meant to do. Its purpose is to explore the origins of characters and explain why they become the people we later meet. In Young Sheldon, that meant revealing the experiences that influenced Sheldon's personality, giving more depth to the Cooper family, and providing the backstory behind many of the stories and references from The Big Bang Theory. If Young Sheldon had stood on its own, free from the need to lead directly into The Big Bang Theory, it could have explored Sheldon's emotions, his family relationships, and the Cooper family's journey with even greater freedom. Instead of being defined by what we already knew was coming, the series could have fully embraced its own direction. However, Young Sheldon was built around answering questions that were raised in The Big Bang Theory. It often existed to explain events from the original series, or show how certain experiences shaped the personalities of characters we had already come to know. Instead of telling a completely independent story, the series frequently looked back at the past to explain the present. In that version, Young Sheldon wouldn't just be remembered as a prequel, it would stand entirely on its own, with its own identity, its own pace, and its own story. In this video, we'll prove that Young Sheldon would have been even better if it hadn't been tied to The Big Bang Theory. To begin, one of the biggest constraints Young Sheldon faced was George Cooper's entire life in the series. The Big Bang Theory had already painted a largely negative picture of him, and that inevitably influenced how his character had to be written in Young Sheldon. One of the biggest controversies revolves around Sheldon's claim that he caught George cheating. In The Big Bang Theory, Sheldon describes walking in on his father with another woman, but Young Sheldon later reveals that the woman was actually Mary, wearing a blonde wig and a German beer maid outfit as part of a roleplay. This raises an obvious question. How could Sheldon, a proclaimed genius, mistake his own mother for someone else simply because she was wearing a wig? Or did the cheating Sheldon described actually happen, and they decided to change the story because audiences had grown to love George? The whole thing feels like the writers were trying to reconcile two versions of George that no longer fit together. George's death is another example.
Where's George?
He had a heart attack.
He's okay, right?
He's gone.
In The Big Bang Theory, Sheldon frequently mentions that his father died when he was young. Because of that, Young Sheldon was always working toward an ending that had already been decided. No matter how much audiences connected with George, the series still had to kill him off when Sheldon was 14 to remain consistent with the established timeline. In an interview, executive producer Steve Holland, when asked about George Cooper's death, said they had to honor all the major events that shaped Sheldon's life in The Big Bang Theory. This show had Young Sheldon not been bound by that future, the writers could have chosen a different path. George might have lived longer. The Cooper family could have continued to grow together, and the story would have been free to follow its own direction, instead of one that had already been written years earlier. By the time Young Sheldon premiered, audiences had already spent 12 seasons with adult Sheldon on The Big Bang Theory. We already knew how his story ended. He would grow up to become a socially awkward, rigid, yet brilliant physicist who struggled to read a room and expressed love in ways that often didn't look like affection to those around him.
Are you gonna miss me?
I haven't given it any thought. I am used to you.
I'm used to you too.
It's not the same as liking you.
The destination was already set, and everything in Young Sheldon had to lead toward that version of Sheldon. That meant every episode of Young Sheldon was, in a way, on an invisible leash. No matter how much Sheldon matured or changed throughout the series, the writers could never let him evolve too far from the character audiences already knew. By the time the show ended, he still had to be recognizably the same Sheldon who would eventually walk into apartment 4A in The Big Bang Theory. His growth was never allowed to completely change who he became, because the future had already been written. Another limitation came from Sheldon's academic journey. In The Big Bang Theory, Sheldon states that he began graduate school at just 14 years old. That single line left young Sheldon with very little freedom to take his education in a different direction, because the writers already knew exactly where he had to end up. As early as season 3, the series begins laying the groundwork for that destination. George takes Sheldon to visit Caltech.
Imagine all the stimulating conversations that must go on at these tables.
I bet.
I can see myself going here one day.
I think you'd fit right in.
Planting the idea of the university long before he eventually attends. Sheldon even receives a recruitment letter from Caltech, but Mary hides it before he ever sees it.
How could you not tell me that Caltech wants me to go to school there?
Because you're not going, so it doesn't matter.
The show later introduces a twist by having Sheldon choose MIT instead, seemingly suggesting that his future might take a different path, but that possibility is short-lived. As a Texas boy completely unprepared for the freezing New England winters, Sheldon quickly abandons the idea of MIT and chooses the warm climate of Caltech in California instead.
Caltech?
Caltech.
It creates the illusion that Sheldon has a choice. The writers could tease a different future, but they ultimately had to guide him back to the path already established in The Big Bang Theory. The show's commitment to connecting every detail to The Big Bang Theory sometimes became so strong that it even explained the specific words Sheldon uses as an adult. In The Big Bang Theory, Sheldon almost always refers to sex as coitus. At first, it seems like just another example of his clinical, overly formal way of speaking, but young Sheldon goes out of its way to explain the origin of that single word. In season 5, after Missy's curiosity about sex creates chaos,
That's silly. All you did was ask questions.
And it's ruining my life. I'm never talking about sex again.
Sheldon and Dr. Sturgis try to investigate why people fear the topic of sex. This ends up costing Dr. Sturgis his job.
And now we know conversations like that can cost you your job.
You learn something new every day.
Sheldon concludes that the problem isn't the topic itself, it's the language people use. So he searches for a term that is completely clinical and emotionally neutral, eventually settling on the word coitus. It's a clever callback, but it also highlights how committed young Sheldon was to explaining nearly every detail Sheldon displayed in The Big Bang Theory. Rather than letting some aspects of his personality simply exist, the show often felt obligated to provide an origin story for even the smallest details. While these moments were enjoyable for longtime fans, they also demonstrate how closely the series was tied to its predecessor, instead of allowing certain traits to remain a mystery. Ironically, the characters with the most freedom in Young Sheldon often became the most beloved. Missy, Georgie, and Meemaw grew into fan favorites, even more popular than Sheldon himself. Missy, in particular, resonated with audiences because she felt so authentic and grounded compared to her genius brother. Unlike Sheldon, George, or Mary, these characters weren't heavily defined by The Big Bang Theory. Missy was only mentioned occasionally. Georgie appeared in just a handful of episodes, and Meemaw, despite being referenced several times, was never explored in much depth. That meant young Sheldon had far more creative freedom with them, and the writers certainly took advantage of that freedom. They turned Georgie into a determined young businessman, gave Missy some of the show's most emotionally powerful storylines, and transformed Meemaw into one of its funniest and most layered characters. But even then, the series couldn't fully escape its identity as a Sheldon prequel. No matter how compelling Missy's struggles or Georgie's ambitions became, the story always had to return to Sheldon, because he was the title character and the bridge connecting the show to The Big Bang Theory. Their arcs could grow, but they were rarely allowed to become the show's true focus for long. It's no coincidence that Georgie finally received the spotlight in Georgie and Mandy's first marriage. Once his story no longer had to revolve around Sheldon, it finally had the freedom to stand on its own. One of the biggest challenges of making a prequel is staying consistent with everything that has already been established. The writers are constantly checking every script against the original series. Did The Big Bang Theory already mention this event? Did adult Sheldon describe this character differently? Would this scene contradict something that was said years earlier? Young Sheldon wasn't immune to that challenge, and it didn't always get everything right. One of the most debated examples is George Cooper. In The Big Bang Theory, Sheldon and Mary often described him as an irresponsible, emotionally distant father, but young Sheldon presented a very different version of George. A flawed man, but also a loving father who genuinely cared about his family and tried his best despite his shortcomings. Fans embraced this more sympathetic portrayal, but it also created noticeable continuity issues. The more young Sheldon developed George into a caring and devoted parent, the harder it became to reconcile him with the man described throughout The Big Bang Theory. As a result, debates quickly emerged among fans over which version of George was the real one, the one described in the original sitcom, or the one audiences spent 7 seasons getting to know. That dilemma perfectly illustrates the challenge of making a prequel. The more compelling Young Sheldon became as its own series, the more it risked contradicting the story it was originally created to support.